the recommendation in the report to better integrate legal services through the county. That includes the county attorney's office and social services. Those conversations are really being led by Fred and Ray, and I'm in the loop on those, but I'm letting Fred take the lead. The areas around those conversations that are taking place are focused on child support and Medicaid, whether or not the social service attorneys can pick up more of that work to free the deputy county attorney to focus on county legal work. One of the benefits of a more integrated department would be to, I think the term in the report was broaden the bench, but more importantly for training and development of attorneys. And I think there's also an important consideration that is tied to legal ethics in that attorneys can't be supervised by non-attorneys legally. They can be supervised for management purposes, but not for legal purposes. So I think that they're trying to work through a better integration to make sure that our attorneys are all in compliance with legal ethics as well as with the management needs of the social service department. As we start to think out beyond the short term, raise the age may require an additional attorney in the county attorney's office, in part because the district attorney's office will no longer be prosecuting those cases. So we have an outside counsel on a part-time basis now. We'll have to monitor the caseload and see if that outside attorney is able to handle the outside caseload or whether or not it makes sense to add an attorney. There's no recommendation to do so, but I think that's something that should be on your horizon and thinking. With the number of contracts that we administer in the legal department, thinking out beyond the immediate term, it might make sense, it probably makes sense to have a contracts administrator, whether that be a paralegal or another attorney, to handle all the contracts. That is a big part of what often becomes a bottleneck in the, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's just, driven by the workload of the number of contracts that are being reviewed. And I think long-term there may be opportunity, and it's probably worth looking at some point, whether or not we should bring some labor or real property legal services inside. We have pretty large outside counsel budgets in both of these areas. And I'm not saying this out of any complaint from the outside legal services we have, but it's worth evaluating at a certain point whether we've crossed a critical threshold that we could do certain things in-house more effectively, or whether we're better served by outside expertise or some more nuanced balance of the two. And I haven't done that analysis yet, but I think it's something that we have to continue to look at. There were a ton of recommendations on social services. They talked about renovating the workspace, which has been already ongoing on, was it the third and fourth floor, or the second and third floor? Those projects are underway, if not completed or near completed. I really liked the recommendation to explore options for expanding hours and services. There's a number of things that have to go into that analysis. One is our staffing levels in terms of can we move people around to provide longer hours that are open access to the public? And if we do that, how does that impact other departments that weren't considered in the report? So for example, if we have hours open into the evening or on the weekends, then we also have to have security to support that. And I don't think this was a high-level recommendation that didn't dig down into those kind of policy and budgetary implications. But I do think that is a recommendation worth further exploration. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the Northwood software. It wasn't able to make the cut for the 2018 budget. I anticipate bringing forward a request again for it in the 2019 budget, but I suggest we also start looking at it at the end third or fourth quarter of this year. And if we're coming in under budget or with a fund balance and the ability to spread that financing out over several years, and the resources are available, then we might want to look at doing, at least committing to that this year and then continuing to budget for it next year. There was a recommendation, or at least a concern raised in the report about the location of the motor pool being distinct from the fuel. There's not a whole lot we can do about that right now. The motor pool is where it is, and the pool and the fuel is where it is. But as I've dug into it more, I've come to learn that that was initially a preliminary solution, that the motor pool was going to be moved over there with the city, and then eventually the idea was that a new motor pool was going to be built out at York Street. Is that correct? I think that's correct. That's what I was told, at least. So I think it's important to remember that I don't know where those discussions are now, or where they've been the last several months, but it prompts the broader dialogue about facilities. Gary keeps reminding me that we need to make a decision about this building. There is often a conversation about whether this decision needs to be to renovate or build a new building. I don't know if anybody has prompted the proposition that it might be a combination of both. But I don't think we can make those decisions without a full assessment of all of our needs, both now and planned into the future. We are going to begin to look at those in the context of our capital improvement planning and try to figure out some recommended solutions to bring to you. But I think all CGR says about this is that it's a problem and we need to fix it. So we can agree with that recommendation, but we still have to do the hard work of figuring out what the solutions are. So with that, I'll open it up to the legislature for any questions you have. As you know, this report was a high-level policy report. It made a number of recommendations without digging down into the real projected costs or savings from each of the recommendations. And I think there's some things we can do now on the short term with minimal cost and investment, and there's other that require more thoughtful analysis of how to proceed. But I'd be happy to answer any of your questions at this point.
I have one.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
On these presentations, it's great that we're making these suggestions, but could you put a cost, like let's say labor relations? Right now, I think we farm out some of our outside counsel, $400,000. And I'd like to see a comparison that if we hired an in-house lawyer to do our labor relations, what the additional cost is or the savings would be to the board.
Yeah, and that's, I think, was one of the recommendations I had for for longer term analysis. But I think you're thinking exactly along the lines I am, Mr. Chairman, that we have to, as we dig into each of these recommendations, develop a more detailed understanding of what those cost projections are, either in terms of increased costs or net savings based on efficiency, such as bringing something in-house. The labor relations isn't just counsel, but also that we provide that counsel for the college. So there's two contracts in that area. And it isn't always necessarily just attorney costs. So, for example, many municipalities, either cities or counties, do have positions such as a labor relations specialist who handle a lot of the negotiations. They're not attorneys, but they're very knowledgeable about the types of issues that are in those contracts, and it can potentially save costs. Now, in our case, at least with our current legal contracts, I believe we're on retainer. So the only way we would save costs if we brought in a position, either legal or otherwise, would be to reassess and renegotiate those legal contracts. But that's certainly something we could look at on the longer term.
Now, I mean, we're always looking for revenue streams, and I know that our industrial site now, if there's an expansion in our existing milk plant, and there's a couple other people that are looking at that. I mean, the more we develop our industrial sites, the more taxes hopefully we can derive, the more we can pay for everybody's raises in health and everything else. So
All depends on what kind of pilots they get.
Yeah, and I'd also like to see in there what it would cost for a future industrial site along with our capital improvements, that we look at maybe something near the thruway, which I think is underdeveloped.
I agree that we have to try to grow the pie. Obviously, the constraints we have to growing the pie are that many economic development projects do have pilots, so to the extent that there's an impact, oftentimes it's off in the future. The report did note, and CGR did recommend an assessment of the sales tax as a potential revenue source. That's a complicated analysis to do, in part because we have a fragmented sales tax ecosystem and that the city has preempted the county. I think the county attorney sent out a briefing on this issue for you, explaining that in order for us to really look at that, we'd have to start with conversations about the city, and that's certainly a conversation that we can initiate, but one that we would need some policy direction from the county, from the legislature, in order to do.
And also with IT, are we presently being webcast or whatever, like the city does?
We're not, but one of the things I've asked Steve to look at, in addition to the website rollout, which I hope to bring to you in the next few months, is I've asked him for a plan that would allow us to upgrade the microphones and some of the technology in this room that would allow for us to position cameras and hit go live and broadcast that to our new website. Or maybe even our current website.
Yeah.
But
Does our floor have some questions? Mr. Joe?
Building analysis.
Joe, could you pull that mic a little closer to?
Building analysis, the legislature has tried to tackle that before, and we haven't had a great stomach to follow through always with the full edge. I'm curious with things like just an assessment, like with probation, for instance. We all know what type restraints they have as far as space and so forth. Looking at major expansion, what they've got now doesn't even begin to cover their needs. So it seems to me like that's a complication that short-term really has to be addressed very quickly.
yeah.
And yet, it seems like based on the pea and shell game we play with the properties we have, we have limited potential.
Yeah, and Mr. DeForest, I think that's exactly right, and one that I hope to help inform you to decide over the next year or so. The short-term guidance I need from the legislature is ultimately one whether you want us to move forward with the lease to parole, whether that makes sense. And we don't have to decide this tonight, but whether it makes sense to move forward with that lease where we provided that, I think, rent-free for a short term. Now we're negotiating a lease, but I question whether that is a sensible lease to move forward with, given our space constraints, especially, in that building.
Yes, Mr. Batman?
Yeah, couple of things. That one is to kind of echo what Mr. Lattimore said, that something that in order for us to move forward, I just went through and looked at, there's somewhere between 9 and 11 new positions that are recommended for the fairly short term. So one of the things we're going to have, I think, is just as Mr. Lattimore suggested, a cost for some of this, and then some sense of priority. 10 to split the difference. 10 new positions is a lot of money. That's $750,000 probably with benefits. That is an ongoing cost. So it's money that has to be generated year after year after year, in addition to the additional cost that we experience in operations. So money becomes a critical issue as we do this, and I know you know that. And my point is that we can't forget that we actually need to look at priorities in that respect. There's the other issue here that I would caution that we be very careful about is a salary survey RFP prematurely. We have unions. The unions have to be involved. They have to agree. It's unlikely that any salary survey will